Good evening and welcome to SPJ New England's continuing Zoom discussion series. I'm freelance journalist Katie Kostakis, and I am pleased to be your host and moderator for tonight's event. Arts and entertainment continues to be and has been one of the most coveted beats in journalism. And tonight I am joined by NPR's marvelous TV critic and media analyst Eric Deggans to chat all about it and roll back the red carpet on the industry. Welcome, Eric, and thank you so much for being here. We're going to cover quite a bit in the next, of course, we're going to cover quite a lot in the next hour and a half that we're spending together. So we'll be taking all of your questions throughout the evening. So go ahead and type them into the chat box and we will throw them at you. So Eric, firstly, let's break down your illustrious career in journalism. Tell us about how you got into the profession. How did you get into it? And who were your favorite journalists to read or watch while growing up?
Sure. So this goes back a ways. I guess when I was transitioning from middle school to high school, I realized I was good at a few things. I was good at writing, and I was a musician. I played the drums and bass guitar and sang. And I wanted to try and find a job where I could earn a steady paycheck doing both of those things. And my dad was a part-time columnist for the newspaper in the city where I lived, the Gary Post-Tribune newspaper. So I thought, I could try and be a pop music critic. And that way I could take my knowledge of music, and I'd take my ability to write and kind of put together in a job where I could get paid to do something cool. And I kind of aimed myself at that through high school and through college. So I was always trying to have musical experiences and also trying to write a lot. So I wrote for the school newspaper and I wrote for the school yearbook in high school and college. I had a column for an independent newspaper in town, and my dad also wrote for when I was in high school. And I tried to tell, important, interesting, substantive stories, not just which football team's going to win at my high school that Friday. And when I got to college, I started a band that did really well, and we got signed to Motown Records while I
Ooh.
was a student. So I took 2.5 years off, made a record with them. Unfortunately, it didn't come out. Motown got sold to MCA before we were able to release our record, and a bunch of acts got dropped, including us. But I understood what it was like to be um, a band signed to a record label that wasn't interested in you. And so I took that, knowledge forward. So when I finally became a pop music critic, I felt like I could really relate to musicians. And I understood what they were going through in making their art, what it was like to tour, what it was like to record, what it was like to play big concerts. I'd done all that stuff. And so I became a pop music critic for the Asbury Park Press in New Jersey. I was their pop music critic. And that was a hometown paper for Bon Jovi and Bruce Springsteen and the Smithereens and a bunch of acts. And I got to know all those people and got to know a bunch of musicians in New York and in Philly. I did one of Questlove's earliest interviews for Music Magazine back in 1992 or something. It's crazy. And and then I became pop music critic at the St. Petersburg Times newspaper in Florida, which eventually became the Tampa Bay Times. And I just realized at a certain point that I was getting too old to cover pop music. Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera and NSYNC and all those acts were getting popular. I didn't understand why people liked them. I didn't like them. I didn't want to write about that stuff. And so when the TV critic at the St. Petersburg Times got a job in Philly, I switched over to television. And it just so happened that I did that at a time when television sort of became the center of pop culture. First, cable kind of exploded. So I moved over in 1997. So cable kind of exploded. We had The Sopranos in 1999. We had The Wire in 2000. We had Sex and the City, and this premium cable space just was percolating, and even sort of standard cable was starting to do really adventurous stuff. And then of course streaming came. I guess that would have been 15 years later, and again, it sort of exploded television's reach in our pop culture consciousness, and so much of our pop culture now comes from social media and streaming and that kind of television. So, I've just been very lucky in that what I cover has kind of followed the heart of pop culture through no, caniness of my own. It's just kind of worked out that way. And as far as inspirations go, I started out as a kid reading a lot of Chicago media. So Chicago writers like Roger Ebert and Mike Rico, who's a famous columnist for the Chicago Tribune, political columnist, but also really good at humor and really adept at writing columns that were sort of insightful and funny and well reported at the same time. And that was a real inspiration. I was inspired by Stan Lee because I'm a comic book nerd and I read all the early, I not even early, but I've been reading comic books my whole life. So I was inspired by the work that Stan Lee did in the 60s and the 70s, and right up to being inspired by, books like The Dark Knight and Watchmen in the 80s and 90s. And even now, Invincible and Walking Dead and graphic novels like that are much more recent. So those are inspirations too, particularly when you're trying to figure out how pop culture works and what people find scary and what people find attractive and what people find sort of off-putting and what they find they want to be a part of. Graphic novels can tell you a lot. And then as I sort of moved along in my career, writers like Leonard Pitts Jr., who was a music critic for the Miami Herald, and then he became a columnist for Knight Ridder, and he just retired a couple of years ago. But he was always like an amazing writer. He always had an encyclopedic knowledge of music. And then he made that transition from being somebody who wrote about serious issues in music to being somebody who just wrote about serious issues and became, an opinion columnist. I've always admired his ability, his facility with writing, but also his ability to sort of talk about pop culture seriously and then move over to, talking about things that, the mainstream of the political establishment views as more serious.
Wow.
Yeah, Gene Robinson, I always liked his work. Um, um, uh, David Carr, the late David Carr, the New York Times media writer, was an inspiration because he also wrote really well, but he also had very well reported columns, and he also broke news, which I like to do occasionally. I don't focus on it, but I do like to keep doing it just to remind people that this job has a journalistic component to it, and that
Sure.
you do want to occasionally break news, particularly if you have the contacts to do it. And you know, it's so now it's to the point where there's so much interesting work being done that you can sample online. That there's a lot of people whose work, you may sample once or twice and be inspired by this thing or that thing, and then it adds to your thing. So, yeah, I guess that's sort of where I'm at now.
Well, today you're one of the most well-known journalists in the industry. You're NPR's first full-time media TV critic and media analyst. You were the first African American to serve as chairman for the jurors who selected George Foster Peabody Awards for Excellence in Electronic Media, University of Georgia. In 2017, you were named one of the country's 15 most influential media reporters by the website Mediaite. And in 2009, you were cited as one of Ebony Magazine's Power 150, a list of influential Black Americans, which also included Oprah Winfrey and the late Gwen Ifill. Those are incredible accolades. So
Thanks.
you've done a lot of other things in addition to entertainment. And I know that while working for the Pittsburgh Post and Gazette back in the early 90s, you helped to create a minority affairs reporting position, and you worked with Pennsylvania State Troopers Academy to develop a training program on racial sensitivity for new recruits. How did that exactly come about?
I don't remember how the state trooper thing happened, but basically, when I got to the Pittsburgh Press, I began to be active with the local chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists. It's called the Pittsburgh Black Media Federation. And at the time, the Pittsburgh Press doesn't exist anymore, but at the time, it was the biggest newspaper in town, and it was the second biggest newspaper in the state. And we sort of realized that the paper wasn't covering race very well. and that Pittsburgh is a town, particularly back then, that had a lot of issues with racial tension. My my mother's side of the family is from the Pittsburgh area. I spent a lot of summers there and Christmases there when I was growing up, and I experienced it firsthand. My mother's side of the family was one of the first Black families to integrate the eastern suburbs of Pittsburgh. And, we faced a lot of sort of weird stereotyping and racism and prejudice back then. So when I came back years later, fresh out of college, I was a municipal reporter in the city's northern suburbs, and I could tell it was still happening. And so that inspired a bunch of us Black staffers at the Pittsburgh Press to try to make the case that the paper should establish a beat. And back then, you had to sort of produce a memo that argued for it. And so I was the person who wound up writing it and gathering together a bunch of feedback from different people across the organization, including my own observations, and kind of, laying out, what this reporter could do and what kind of stories they could get that we weren't getting, how it would help balance the paper's coverage overall, that kind of stuff. And eventually, um, someone, I think, ended up filling a job like that. Like there were a bunch of things. There was a strike, and the ownership of the paper was changed, and there was a bunch of stuff that happened. But I think once the dust settled, someone actually did wind up filling that job. But by the time that happened, I had been hired as the pop music critic for the Asbury Park Press, and I'd left town. But what I learned was that newsrooms have a hard time talking about stuff like race. I don't think it's gotten much better now than it was back in the 90s. And you're dealing with people who are very cynical about issues sometimes. And you're dealing with people who don't want to believe that they have a blind spot. And they feel like if you're telling them they have a blind spot, that you're saying that they're racist, which you're not. But we've all been raised in this society in America that has taught us to elevate white culture and to de-emphasize non-white culture. And it particularly happens in newspapers because newspapers have a very acute sense of who their readership is and what kind of stories they want to see. And unfortunately, a lot of times that comes from managers assuming that the readers are just like them. And so whatever they are interested in, they assume that's what their readers are interested in. And that's the kind of stuff that they push for coverage of. And they're less interested in things that are outside of their experience that they feel the readership won't be interested in. And so then the newspaper becomes this document that is constantly telling non-white people, you don't matter as much. We went and covered this street fair, and even though there were a lot of people of color there, there's only one picture of a non-white person in a spread of 7 photos. We don't care as much about you. When we do a fashion spread telling people about Halloween costumes, we don't feature anybody who's Black. It's all white people playing white characters like Indiana Jones and Doctor Strange, um, and it's just a subtle or not so subtle way of saying to Black readers, we don't care about you, or we don't care about you as much. Here's the culture that we prioritize, and if we can get to your thing, we will. But when we think about everybody, we're not really thinking about you. And so then people wonder why, you have a newspaper in a town like Philly that's, I don't know, 50 or more, 50 or more percent Black. And the readership of the newspaper is low amongst African Americans comparatively. And we had the same problem in Pittsburgh, and we had the same problem at the Tampa Bay Times, because you wind up creating this document that tells people every day, your culture doesn't matter as much as our culture. And that's why reporting positions like that are important. And more importantly, it's important for the whole staff to become cognizant about racial issues, to become cognizant about making race a regular part of their coverage. When you watch a network TV newscast, there's always a moment about 60% of the way through the show where they talk about the stock market, and they talk about how the stock market did that day. And it may only last a few minutes, but it's their way of saying, here's the economic health of the nation summed up in a look at the stock market. But we never take a minute in every broadcast to talk about race or diversity or inclusion, or culture. And so we only wind up talking about those things in, big newspapers, in major news broadcasts when there's a crisis, when someone's
Right.
lost a job, someone's been killed, something terrible has happened. And now, oh, by the way, we want to talk about the most combustible subject in American society. And so one way that we can get past that is by creating mechanisms inside newsrooms where we're regularly talking about this stuff, we're regularly covering it, and it doesn't feel like when there's a story about race in the paper or a story about race in the broadcast that, oh my God, here's a signal that something terrible happened, because we only talk about race when something terrible happened. you know and so all of those ideas, in different forms, were in that document. So I'm not surprised. I mean, I'm glad that they eventually created the job. I thought they should have created it when I first wrote the paper. It took years for it to happen, but I'm glad it did.
Do you know if they're still using the program now, or?
I would be amazed if they were.
Oh,
The ownership is in conflict with the staff, the union that represents the writers.
yeah.
Writers have been
Okay.
on strike for a long time. It's a very contentious situation in Pittsburgh now. It's a very different situation than it was when I worked there.
Wow. Okay. So next question. And by the way, folks, if you do have questions, please by all means type them on in the chat box and we'll throw them out all during this evening. So you covered the Woodstock 94 Music Festival, remember that? And wrote a
Absolutely.
feature about the anti-racist skinhead movement. How did you
Yeah.
find this story? And do you normally look for social justice themes in the stories that you choose?
I mean, I guess you could put it that way. I came to the Asbury Park Press in New Jersey. It was the #2 paper in the state as well. And I came in with this idea of trying to cover pop music in a way that was a little different than the person who'd covered it before me. The guy who'd written about it before me was an amazing writer and very perceptive. But I thought he was a little too focused on rock music, particularly experimental rock music that was happening in New York City. And and there's a wide breadth of stuff that was going on in that town. And the great thing about being in New Jersey is that you are equidistant from Manhattan and Philly. So you're an hour from each place. And you're really only a few hours away from Atlantic City and a few more hours away from DC. So if you want to talk to musicians and talk to artists who are doing incredible things in New York City or in North Jersey. I mean, at the time, Queen Latifah was starting to break big. She's
Yep.
from Newark. At the time, um, um, David Letterman had just moved from NBC to CBS, and he had set up shop in the Ed Sullivan Theater. And one of the keyboard players in the CBS orchestra, that the band that he revamped when he moved from NBC, was Bernie Worrell, who's this incredibly well-known keyboard player. He played on Stop Making Sense to Talking Heads records. He played with Parliament Funkadelic, and he lived in Jersey. So I was able to go hang out with him and get a sense of what Letterman was going to be up to musically because I was hanging out with him. And so I always had this sense that, music touches a lot of different issues and places in life. And it doesn't have to just be about what's the most recent record or what's the coolest concert tour. Is there a way to talk about music and talk about the people who make music and the people who love music in different ways? And so I started, part of the job is hanging out in clubs, especially back then. And I met this guy who was a skinhead and said he was an anti-racist skinhead. And at the time, racist skinheads were getting a lot of attention, particularly in the Philadelphia area and in South Jersey. And this fellow that I had met, who was kind of involved with booking clubs in at Rutgers University, um, was upset about it, and he felt like there was a whole network of anti-racist skinheads who existed in New Jersey and New York, and nobody was writing about them. And I was like, okay, well, just show me. take me and meet these people. And so he introduced me to a guy who was running for the state legislature in New Jersey, who was an anti-racist skinhead. He brought me to a store owner in North Jersey, who was an anti-racist skinhead who was selling a lot of the paraphernalia that skinheads would wear, but he wouldn't sell anything that was associated with racism or white supremacy or Nazis. And he would kick, if anybody came in wearing that stuff and he got the sense that they were a racist, he would kick them out of his store. And then, sort of as the main thing, he brought me to this club in Alphabet City in New York. It was called the Gas Station, and it was a refurbished gas station that was turned into a performance space. And 200 skinheads showed up for this ska concert there. They were all anti-racist. Many of them were Black and brown and Asian. Skinheads, just because they're anti-racist doesn't mean they're not like violent and knuckleheads. So it was a pretty dodgy situation to be in with all these people
Right.
drinking and slam dancing and things like that. But I felt a little safer because obviously they weren't racist, and they were very committed to anti-racism. They weren't just not racist. They were committed to opposing racist skinheads and trying to break down their power and break down their um, institutions and try to convert people into dropping the racism. And so, it was so exciting that I figured, and it was centered around music, it was centered around clubs, it was centered around bands. The whole skinhead culture was about, listening to certain kinds of music and going to certain kinds of clubs and hearing certain kinds of bands. And so it just seemed very natural to do this project where we looked at all those different things and we really probed these people on their beliefs, and we really talked about their fight against racism and how they were being stereotyped and they were facing prejudice because people didn't believe that they weren't racist. And it does take it does take a step of you have to, it's a leap of faith. I got into a van with this one guy, the anti-racist skinhead who I first met, who was gay and Hispanic, and so I figured, well, he's probably not racist, but you never know. And then I got into a van with him and like three other skinheads, and we rode from New Jersey to Alphabet City to this club, and then we get out of the van and it's 200 of these cats. And if they decided they wanted to stomp me into the ground, I'd be gone. So it was a little bit of a leap of faith to just think, I think I know this guy well enough. I think I can trust him. And I'm pretty sure he wouldn't take me in a situation where I would be in danger. And he seemed to have a lot of respect in the community. And it all worked out very well. We wound up doing a really great series of stories for the Asbury Park Press. But that's what I was always trying to figure out ways to do things different, do some distinctive coverage, write about things in a way that, typical music critics wouldn't write about them. Because I felt like the bar was set kind of low by people who were just doing what had always been done. And I felt like, if you want to distinguish yourself in a job like this, you have to bring yourself to it. Because the one thing that nobody else will have, no matter how many people are involved in covering arts and entertainment, no one else is you, right? So what is distinctive about you that you can bring to the work that will produce stories that no one else can do? And part of it is just sort of my understanding of race and culture and how that works. I've always been fascinated by it. I've always studied it, looked at tons of research, talked to tons of experts who've devoted their careers to analyzing it. And so when I go to write about a racial element in media, or I went to do these stories that talked about race and culture and music, it wasn't just somebody coming in off the street and asking musicians what they think. This is somebody who has some expertise, who has spent time training other people how to recognize racial dynamics in life and in systems, and somebody who spent a lot of time studying the subject, and that continues to be the case. And I feel like it's led me to make observations and land on stories that other people just wouldn't, because they don't have that training and they don't have that experience. and it's not unique to them, you know. Being a Black person in being a Black um, culture critic, whether you're no matter what you're covering, if you're doing it for a mainstream media outlet, you not only have to figure out what moves you and what makes you want to write about things, you have to figure out what your audience cares about, and your audience is probably going to be white. And so I have to do an extra step that a lot of my white colleagues don't have to do, because I have to say to myself, what is the bulk of my audience going to think about this thing? And how can I produce coverage that sort of meets their needs and their interests, in addition to how I'm reacting to it, because of where I come from culturally. And just being able to switch perspectives when you think about what you're going to do gives me an insight overall, and gives me, I went through this and sort of arguing with people about Lily Gladstone not being named Best Actress in the Oscars.
We were talking about that a minute ago. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and she would have made history as the first Native American woman to win a major acting Oscar. And so many people were saying, well, you just wanted her to win because of race, and aren't you saying that race should be a consideration when people think about these awards? And I'm saying, no, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that because I'm someone who stands outside of white culture and sees how it dominates entertainment, I have a different reaction when I see the performance of somebody like Lily Gladstone, who overcomes all of that to give such an amazing performance as a woman who's being slowly poisoned by the man who claims he loves her. And that moves me more than seeing an excellent performance by Emma Stone, where she plays, a manufactured woman who's having a lot of sex, trying to figure out her agency in life. And so these are both great performances, but the yardstick I'm using to judge them is a little different than some other people. And that doesn't mean that the yardstick is invalid. It just means that it's different. And it doesn't mean I'm saying race should count. What it means is that I view this situation differently because of my own experiences, my culture, my background. And that's what diversity is all about. That's the whole point. So I think people sometimes don't understand. It's not about getting people who look different to think the same way, to accept that the same culture should control everything, to bend the knee to domination by any one perspective. It's about trying to have those other perspectives who aren't part of the power structure get the respect that they deserve and the consideration that they deserve. That's what real diversity is.
Great. I know I've been eager to watch both of those movies. I haven't yet, but I'm very much looking forward to it. And what I wanted to ask about that, going back to when we had talked about Lily Gladstone before, can you share a little bit about our little discussion before we began, how I had said that most people pretty much thought that she was a lock to win, and the big spoiler, of course, that Emma Stone did go ahead and pick up the Best Actress award. Can you kind of delve into a little bit about what we were talking about before, how it wasn't as cut and dry as I guess maybe some of us thought about her
Well, I
loss?
think, I think, yeah, I think a lot of people thought Lily Gladstone was going to win because she had won some pivotal contests leading up to it, including winning Best Actress in the Golden Globes and Best Actress in the Screen Actors Guild. But those of us who have been tracking the Oscars for a while know that Oscar voters tend to resist voting in a way that feeds into a narrative that people want.
Okay.
When Chadwick Boseman had died and he was posthumously competing for Best Actor, a lot of people thought he was going to win, and they had changed the order of the televised ceremony so that the Best Actor award would be announced at the end, because they thought Chadwick Boseman was going to win, and Oscar voters gave it to Anthony Hopkins. And so,
They
um,
kind of did that with
and
Lily, if with the Best Actress category, if I'm right, that they actually pushed it back to
yeah,
be
yeah,
the
they
last
moved that
award of
to
the night.
more towards the back too, because again, they thought if she wins, it would make history, and her speech would probably be powerful and all of that.
And
But the Oscar voters tend to resist that stuff. And one of the things I was thinking, I mean, I was hoping that Lily Gladstone would win it. for the history that it would make, for the fact that her performance, I felt she delivered a more subtle performance in a better movie. Um, Emma Stone delivered a much more obviously high quality, performative kind of experience in a movie that, frankly, I didn't think was as good as Killers of the Flower Moon. So it's hard to weigh those two things, you know. And I think I think she absolutely earned the Oscar, and I don't quibble her being awarded it. Um, but I did think once the nominations were announced, and there was some backlash to what happened with Barbie, and the fact that Greta Gerwig and Margot
Margot
Robbie
Robbie.
were nominated for Best Director and Best Actress, that would affect the Oscar voting. And like I said, they have a history of not playing into narratives, not voting in a way that, you know, people might hope they would vote because the win would bring some sort of poignant, you know, history making thing. They have a tendency to resist that in recent years. And Poor Things seem to be gaining a lot of traction sort of late in the awards game. And to me, it's the kind of movie that Oscar likes because it's creatively weird. And sometimes I think award shows confuse creatively weird with creatively high quality. Um, there's a lot of great performances in Poor Things. I don't think it adds up to a movie that makes a powerful, complete statement. Not in the way that Killers of the Flower Moon does, or American Fiction does, or Oppenheimer does. But it is creatively really ambitious, and so much about it is really arresting. You can tell they're really going for it, and they're talking about things in a way that they know, you know, is taking risks. And I think that's what the Oscar voters kind of responded to. And so I thought to myself as we were coming up to the ceremony that if anybody was going to win it, if anybody was going to unseat Lily Gladstone, it's probably going to be Emma Stone. Also, the final sort of criteria is that Emma Stone's won before, and she has a great reputation, and Oscar voters seem to really like her. So that's also, you know, that also
Exactly.
gives you a sense that they have
Yeah.
a strong candidacy. So I think she kind of came out of nowhere, you know, in a sense. People weren't expecting Poor Things, the movie, to be a contender early in the award season. But once people saw the movie and saw the creative swings they were taking, and saw Emma Stone's amazing performance, which really was amazing, you know, I think that's when it really started to become a contender, and it kind of came out of nowhere in a way.
Yeah, the funny thing is that Yorgos Lanthimos, who of course directed Poor Things, has a tendency to really kind of think outside of the box with every single film he does. I
Yeah.
mean, with from The Favorite to an early film he did, which was the killing of a was yeah the killing of a sacred deer, which is actually based on a play by Euripides called Iphigenia. And you kind of have this inane feeling when it comes to his direction and his art that he's just taking everything that you can think of and kind of spin it in a way where you don't know where it's going to end up next. So, like I said,
Yeah.
I truly was surprised that she did pick up the Oscar because, like I said, everyone was campaigning for Lily. Everyone said, okay, Lily's going to take it, so on and so forth. So I know that this was a really nice surprise, and you could tell that Emma Stone was not expecting it when she went up to
Yeah,
accept,
yeah, she wasn't
and she
expecting.
was
Well,
absolutely gracious, and her dress broke and everything. So
but I also think that shows why, you know, having some experience and looking at this stuff is important. Because even though there's a lot of buzz out there about this candidate or that candidate, there may be substantive reasons why someone else is posing a strong candidacy for the same award. And in this case, I think what surprised people was that Lily Gladstone had done so well in all these other contests leading up to the Oscars. And people like to say that those contests are sort of like a bellwether, that if, you know, who you look at who wins the Golden Globes, you look at who wins the SAG, you look at who wins the Producer Guild Awards, you look at who wins, you know, the New York Critics and the LA Critics Awards, and that gives you some sense of how the movie is judged. But I think that they can also kind of be misleading because Oscar voters may see that momentum building and say, you know, we don't want to feed into that narrative. We're
Right.
going to make a different choice. And I think that, you
Definitely.
know, the fact, for example, that Greta Gerwig and Margot Robbie weren't nominated in those respective categories was a sense that Oscar voters are not willing to just make the choice that everybody thinks they should make,
Right.
even when not making the choice doesn't make any sense. I know, I don't know how you know, they both Margot Robbie and Greta Gerwig were nominated for Oscars because they were producers, and when
Right.
the movie was nominated as Best Picture, they were both nominated, and then the screenplay was nominated, so Greta Gerwig was nominated there. How do you nominate them in those two categories, but you don't nominate them for actually
Right.
for the things they actually did to make the movie happen? It
Right.
just
Now,
it just you know, that stuff like that doesn't even make sense. So, you know, you can try to parse this stuff as much as, you know, I mean, you can try to parse this stuff 1,000 ways, but in the end, you know, how a body votes when everybody gets together and, you know, casts their ballots, there's a certain sense of mystery to it, which is why we're so interested in it. You know, it's never completely easy to forecast, even when you had something like the Golden Globes, where you know, a lot of that went the way people expected it to.
it was the Golden Globes. It's kind of
Yeah.
they've had kind of the same format for a while. Now, here's one question I was wondering. Going into, I guess, when but you're talking about Barbie, going into when Barbie was first kind of green lighted and you knew it was kind of coming out, was there kind of an air of skepticism from you at all, or from other critics who are like, wait a second, you guys are going to adapt a movie about a doll, like, not, you know,
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
because I've kind of wondering, because I, to be honest with you, I haven't seen Barbie yet, and I'm still a little on the fence, kind of like, but it's
Well, I
Barbie.
mean, you know, the thing that's unfortunate about going to see it now is that you're seeing it after you've heard all these people talk about it. Like
Right.
I saw Barbie right when it came out.
Right.
And so for me, you know, I saw the movie. I mean, I'd already heard a bit about it, but I saw it before there was this deluge of think pieces and, you know, the stories on television and, you know, endless interviews with the people in the movie and all the campaigning. You know, I saw it before all that happened. And so I was able to have an impression of it that was separate from all of that. I think it's quite a good movie. It was a surprisingly good movie for me because, as you said, you know, you can be cynical when you hear that a big studio is spending a bunch of money to make a movie about a toy. You know, in the past, that has given us Transformers, and that has given us G.I. Joe. And no one is going to say that either of those movies have qualified for anything in the Oscars except for visual effects and stunts,
Right.
maybe.
And Pirates of the
So
Caribbean.
well, Pirates of the
Yeah.
Caribbean, that's based on a
A
ride
ride.
in
Right. So it's kind of that
in,
just,
in an amusement park ride,
right.
which is a little different. I mean, at least an amusement park ride has a story at the center of it.
Right.
You know, when you're saying I'm going to make a movie about a doll, you know, what
Right.
does that mean, right? And
Right.
in particular with Barbie, you know, there had been so much controversy over Barbie's role in sort of modern society and whether it even made sense to, you know, have respect for that toy, given, you know, women's fight for agency and and some independence from all these traditional gender roles that get pushed on them. So is Barbie helping in that, or is Barbie helping to buttress that? Um, and you know, to Greta Gerwig and Margot Robbie's credit, you know, first of all, it wasn't a slam dunk sale that this movie was going to get made. You know, Greta Gerwig and Margot Robbie had to put their heads together and come up with a really great presentation to sell this movie to the studio that was going to make it, because they knew it was going to cost a lot of money, and they knew that it wasn't necessarily a guaranteed success, and they knew that some of the themes they were going to be tackling in the movie might be controversial and that people might not embrace them. But they, you know, they stuck to their ideas and they got a movie made that I think was original and inspiring and said a lot of interesting things. and it might not have been as edgy or pushed the boundaries as much as some other movies, but I think it did a lot. I really think it did. And so but so what I'm always trying to do to sort of back this up to how you do the job, what I've always tried to do is to have a healthy enough skepticism that I don't fall for hype, but not to be so cynical and skeptical that I can't be hopeful that something will be good. And the first thing I always tell people is I try not to judge something until I've seen it. And
Right.
I think that's a really, really important rule that many people covering pop culture and entertainment routinely disregard, which is no matter how weird the concept or stupid the concept or craven the concept sounds when you hear about it, you don't judge it until you actually see it.
Right.
I remember HBO had announced that they were working on a story called Confederate that was going to be a series that would posit what would America look like if the South had won the Civil War
Hmm.
and slavery was still in force in the southern states in the modern times. And people really kind of lost it and were highly critical of HBO for even thinking about doing it. And I said, show me the script. Let me see the thing. It sounds like it would be something really hard for anybody to pull off, but particularly HBO had hired the showrunners for Game of Thrones to work with a black couple to do it. And the showrunners for Game of Thrones did not have a great track record because there were a lot of diversity issues on that show. So, people had a huge amount of skepticism that the guys who had all these problems with race on Game of Thrones were suddenly going to become experts in talking about race and doing this series. Um, but in the end, I'm like, I just want to see. I have to see it. I can't judge it until I see it. And it never got
So
made.
it never got made? Did you get a chance to look at the script or anything? Did you
No,
have a
they didn't
chance to
have.
kind of go over?
They never got to a script. I
Okay.
interviewed. I interviewed Malcolm Spellman, who was one half of the black couple who was going to work with the Game of Thrones creators. I interviewed him and his wife. I think I interviewed both of them to get a sense of what their ideas were. And Malcolm wound up becoming the showrunner on the Winter Soldier and the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. So he wound up masterminding that whole story about how the Falcon became the Black Captain America, and he got to talk about race in the way that he wanted to in doing that show when the HBO thing fell apart. But I could tell from talking to him that he had a lot of interesting ideas about how to bring conversations about race to a scripted show. And so I was kind of interested to see what they would come up with. And I can understand people being wary and wondering, what happens if they go ahead and make it, and then it's this monstrosity, this horrific thing, and then you have to deal with it kind of being out there. I totally understand that. But I think for critics in particular, it's important for us to try to avoid completely prejudging something until we've seen it. And if it's possible to see it without too many opinions from other people, it's better. That's why I try to see the movies that look like they're going to be Oscar contenders as early in the process as I can, because I don't really want to hear what other people have to say about them. I want to be able to watch them myself, relatively free from other people's points of view, and in particularly relatively free. There's a lot of other people involved in covering pop culture and entertainment who are super cynical, and I just absolutely hate that. I think it really poisons people's coverage, and it may keep them, it's a defense mechanism in a way to keep them from falling for the tremendous hype and the tremendous amount of lying that goes on in entertainment. And I totally understand it. And you really should be skeptical of everything anybody tells you, especially if they're an executive at a media company or film or television company. Always check your wallet when you're talking to those people. But but I do, and I think, you know, the people that I've worked with in the industry who know me know that I'm willing to be fair. And to be fair means you have to be open-minded and you have to watch something without too many preconceptions and be willing to give it a shot. And
Yeah.
sometimes you can be pleasantly surprised. And then sometimes, you know, sort of your worst fears kind of come through. But if you go into it so cynical that you can't even allow that this thing might be good, or that there might be people who would enjoy seeing it, even if you don't think it's good, then, you know, I just hate that. I just, when I sense that in someone else's coverage, I immediately am not interested in reading anymore or seeing anymore or experiencing anymore, because I feel like they're too close-minded to really provide high quality coverage.
Understandable. I just want to change gears for just a teeny bit and talk about
Mhm.
some other past things you've done.
Okay.
So back in 2004, you wrote a column for the then St. Petersburg Times, which you also mentioned is now the Tampa Bay Times,
Mhm.
entitled Jason Blair and the Fear Factor, in
Yeah.
which you wrote, quote, minority journalists already worried about being taken seriously in their newsrooms now see a new hurdle to overcome. Taught that we have to be twice as good to get half as far, we now worry there's no room for error, end quote. And you also said that, quote, it's an unfortunate truth. If a black journalist turns out to be, excuse me, a mediocre hire or worse, the finger pointing begins in a way white journalists rarely face, end quote. Do you think things have improved at all since the Blair scandal? What's your take on what's happened since?
Um, I mean, I guess things may have improved marginally, but I think that that dynamic still exists and it's still very much a problem for journalists of color. You know, I was reading coverage of Kim Godwin, who's the head of ABC News. And, you know, she's been in the news over the months and years. You know, they had an issue where two anchors for Good Morning America began seeing each other, and there's some question about whether it was an affair or whether they had kind of wrapped up the
Mm-hmm.
relationships that they had been in and they started seeing each other. But it got covered by the tabloids and became an embarrassment for ABC. And so those people wound up leaving.
Yes.
And and that was, you know, that was considered sort of a black mark on ABC. And there's a lot of turmoil inside of ABC News because Kim is trying to change the culture of the place, and some of the people who've been there for a while think it may make their journalism worse, and so they're resisting it. And then recently, an executive was installed to sort of stand in between Kim and the top executive running broadcasting and platforms and stuff for Disney. So that was considered something of a demotion. And I'm looking at some of this coverage, and I'm thinking to myself, you know, there's a lot of second guessing of her management techniques and her abilities that I don't often see in coverage of top executives like this, absent, you know, a long string of problems, you know, and you know, it just makes you wonder, like, what yardstick are they using to judge her? You know, how bad did things have to get at CNN before Chris Lick got bounced versus, you know, the stuff that's going on in ABC News? So I think you run into these people, and you know, I write a lot about race and media, and so I'm having a lot of interactions with people on social media. When I post a story, it starts conversation, and you run into these people who have the sense that you know, if a person of color gets an important position, immediately there's suspicion that there was some sort of diversity initiative, or there was some sort of affirmative action, or some sort of, you know, allowance made for their race, and that was part of the reason why they were hired. And so the person who gets that job then has to perform super well just to prove that they should have gotten the job, and that if their race was a consideration, it wasn't a primary consideration, that they were able to shine in the job regardless. Um, And yet, you know, if a white person got hired for that job and did a mediocre job, people wouldn't be saying that he got hired for that job because he was white. They wouldn't be saying that he failed in the job because he was white. They would be saying that he failed because he was a mediocre manager. And at some point, I hope we get to the point where people of color stop becoming symbols and they can stand on their own 2 feet and their own achievements. Now, it doesn't mean that adding diversity to your staff shouldn't be a consideration. It should be, because from my standpoint, number one, it's part of accuracy. You know, when we talk about diversity, and I'm sure at the Society of Professional Journalists, you guys talk about it, we talk about it as, you know, this is something we want to do to make our community more equitable and to make the industry more fair, and all of that stuff is wonderful. But to me, the reason why diversity counts is that it makes your journalism more accurate. If you're going to go in and cover a murder in a certain community and you don't have someone who speaks the language of most of the people who live there on your staff, how accurate is that story going to be? If you have to go into a different community and you have to talk about a conflict that broke out between people from 2 different neighborhoods, and one neighborhood's white and one neighborhood's black, and you don't have any black reporters to send in to talk to people that the sources might trust, how much harder is it going to be for you to accurately figure out what exactly happened? Diversity in newsrooms and diversity in media is about accuracy, which is a core journalism value. And so people who think of it as something we should do because it brings equity, all of that is the wonderful things that happen once you create a newsroom that represents the community it's covering and that is accurately reporting what is happening in that community more often than not. So, all of this sort of gets wrapped up in these issues when you're trying to talk about this stuff, and when you're trying to talk about bringing on journalists of color into news organizations where there might not be a lot of diversity, and then trying to help those people succeed and face the situation where they have this added extra pressure. I did a story a few years ago where I talked to all these Black people who had been on Survivor, the reality TV show, and they eventually decided to band together and start doing press and start doing podcasts to talk about how they felt the show was more difficult for people of color to compete on, and that they had been trying to talk to the network and the producers about this for years, and they had gotten no really effective, adequate response. And what they would say is, you're in this highly competitive environment. 16 people are placed in this isolated area. They have limited food. They have all these physical challenges and mental challenges. And they're competing in tribes first. So they have to work as a team. And then eventually it gets down to a single person is going to try and win this thing. And so there's all kinds of weird dynamics going on anyway. On top of that, if you only have 2 or 3 or even 4 people of color amongst 16 contestants, then those people of color get isolated really quickly. And they have to deal with all the racial dynamics that happen in how people of color can be marginalized in big groups, in addition to all the other challenges that everybody else faces just being a contestant on Survivor. And the way to alleviate that, of course, is to cast more people of color on the show and to have more people of color behind the scenes working as producers to navigate these issues when they come up on the show. And yet, the show constantly resisted this. I remember trying on multiple occasions to try and talk to the executive producer who was credited with bringing Survivor to America, Mark Burnett. And I tried to talk to him about it at a press party for the very first season of Survivor. I noticed racial dynamics on the show, and I tried to talk to him about it, and he jumped back like I was trying to touch him with a hot poker.
Uh-oh.
And when I wrote my book, Over My Shoulder, Race Bader, where
Yeah, we're gonna bring that up in a minute.
there's a chapter about reality TV, and I talked about Survivor. I wanted to interview Mark Burnett, and he would only answer questions via email. And there was a recent incident you may have seen in the news where I tried to ask three producers on The Bachelor about race on the show, and they wouldn't
Yep.
answer. Um, that is not how you solve these problems.
Right.
And so eventually what happened was George Cheeks, the CEO of CBS, who is a black man, decided to require that every unscripted show on CBS, half the cast has to be non-white. Right after he did that, the first black man won Big Brother, and then the first black woman won Big Brother, the next edition. And all of a sudden, people of color have a much better chance of doing well on these shows. And so it's as simple as, if you want to create an equitable environment, you have to have diversity in your newsroom. You have to have diversity in your staff. It will make things easier for the people of color who are working there, and it will create equity that spreads throughout the organization. Um, and like I said, a small part of this is about, doing good, and so much more of this is about being accurate.
Right. I was actually going to bring up that um, the piece you wrote about The Bachelor. So in case any of you aren't familiar with that particular piece, it came out last month, and it was during your experience at the Television Critics Association's Winter Press Tour. So from what I understand is you were sitting in on a panel with the producers of The Bachelor. And tell me a little bit about how all that transpired. From what I understand, you were actually questioning, like you mentioned before, about the issues with diversity that the show has had in its multiple seasons. Can you talk a little more about that in detail?
Sure, sure. So the TV Critics Association holds regular press events in Los Angeles. And so in February, we had 10 days of press conferences, and one of those press conferences featured a bunch of producers of unscripted content on ABC. So it wasn't just the producers from The Bachelor, it was a producer of Jeopardy and a producer from, two or three other shows. But producers who work in reality TV don't often appear at these kinds of press conferences. And in fact, I mean, I'm not, this was my first chance to question somebody connected to The Bachelor in a press conference in a long time. So I was eager to ask them about how racial issues affect the show, because they had an incident a few years ago when they had the first black man serve as the star of The Bachelor. So it was a black man choosing amongst, something like 24 women. And they had a lot of problems with race on the show. The black man himself, once he had finished his run on the show, had criticized how ABC had handled some issues. Um, the woman that the guy picked had some questionable things in her past, including attending an antebellum party, and antebellum themed party. And the show handled that criticism badly, and the host of the show, Chris Harrison, handled responding to it badly in an interview, and he wound up leaving the show. And the first black woman to be on The Bachelorette, to be on the female-centered version of the show, has also criticized how ABC and The Bachelor handles race. So, I get this opportunity. There's three producers from the show there, and I go, um, why do you think the show has had such a hard time talking about race, um, particularly in these incidents that have left pioneers on the show feeling like the show doesn't handle race well, and a scandal that cost you a host? And one of the producers tried to answer about what they were doing currently on the show, but she hadn't worked on The Bachelor back when these other things happened, even though they only happened a few years ago. And I said, all due respect, you're not answering the question I asked, which was, why has The Bachelor had such a hard time talking about race, particularly when Black people are the star of the show? And 8 seconds passed. I recorded it because I'm a radio reporter, and I counted it. 8 seconds passed. They didn't say anything, and the questioning just kind of moved on. I said, well, I guess I guess we have our answer. And the press conference moved on, and it became such a moment that, lots of media outlets wrote about it. Just about every major trade platform did a story about it. And, from my standpoint, I feel like it just shows that that it is so hard for them to face how white-centered The Bachelor is. And it is so hard for them to talk about how the show approaches race that when you ask them about it, they freeze like a deer in headlights. They're not comfortable having those discussions. And frankly, I don't think they're that equipped to have those discussions because for so long they shrugged them off and acted as if they don't matter. And that when journalists ask them about them, what they're doing is asking gotcha questions and trying to make a big splash and trying to make news. And I'm not necessarily trying to do any of that. All I want is to have a real discussion with somebody who works at The Bachelor on the record about how that show handles race. And frankly, it shouldn't be this hard. If it wasn't that big an issue, as they keep saying, if they're handling it well, as they keep saying, then it shouldn't be hard for them to provide somebody who's worked on the show for several years who can say, here's how we approach these situations. Here's why they played out the way they did. Here's how we change things so that it's different going forward. And the fact that they won't do it tells me that there's a problem that they won't acknowledge. And, I'm entirely willing to talk to whoever's willing to talk to me and hear about the possibility that I'm wrong about that and that there's something else going on. But right now, the way they're acting is they don't want to be transparent. And that's really unfortunate.
Right. Apologies. I had technical difficulties. My Wi-Fi cut out right when you were beginning the question. So my
Sure.
apologies to all of you. I also do want to ask in relationship to that. I know that definitely the diversity when it comes to race has been a play, into with The Bachelor. But have you also, was there anyone on the panel who may have expressed other opinions, considering that they rarely will use people of size? They will rarely use people over the age of 40, except for now the most recently, which was the Golden Bachelor, which of course is
Right.
is on the other side of the spectrum, is that you had the demographics for 60 and older. If I remember, the man who was competing on The Bachelor was in his 70s, and the woman he ended up marrying was in her 60s. And of course, on The Bachelor itself, you pretty much have a range from in their 20s to late 30s. And at that point, they've kind of intimated that was a little bit on the older side. So was there anybody in the room that you were in observing the panel kind of throwing that into the mix at all, or no?
Well, I mean, given how badly they handled the race question, I don't know that there was a lot of appetite in the room to try and ask them. Oh, and this other thing too that you
Right.
are probably not going to say anything about. I mean, I've long said that my problem with The Bachelor, which I'm highly critical of the show, is that it's this white-centered princess fantasy brought to life, and it reinforces all these rigid traditional ideas about gender and romance and wealth and class and who deserves love and who doesn't, who's attractive and who isn't. Um, you know, what I would say about the things that you've said is that those same issues that I said about race would make it very difficult. For example, if they cast two or three women who were in their 50s in a regular edition of The Bachelor, they would be surrounded by women who were in their 20s and 30s. And The Bachelor himself would probably be in his 30s. And so, what chance are they going to have winning a competition like that when they're in such a different place in their life than everyone else who's competing on the show? So they create the Golden Bachelor, and most of the people on that show were in their late 60s or early 70s. Um, but I didn't watch a whole lot of it because, like I say, I'm not a big fan of the Bachelor franchise. But my sense of it was that a lot of these people were trying to look like they were much younger, look and act like they were much younger than they were. And so now you've got this show that's sort of reinforcing these ideas about, accepting your age and trying really hard to look young and that being valued rather than looking the way you look and having that be cool. Again, I didn't watch it in depth. So if I'm wrong about that, I apologize. But my sense of it was that we were getting all these weird notions about what aging means and what appearance means, and as you mentioned, of course, they don't often have uh, people who are of great size on the show either. But again, when you cast people who are sort of outliers on a show that is presenting a very traditional vision of what is attractive and what is not, then all you're doing is setting those people up to fail. And I think one of the big problems that The Bachelor has is that it cannot admit how centered on whiteness the show is. So when people of color come on that show, how do you handle them, and how do you handle the idea, the probability that when the Bachelor is white, non-white contestants, women, are probably not going to do well, especially Black women. They're probably not going to make it to the end. They're probably not going to be picked, you know? And how do you handle that? And do you massage that in a way that sort of glosses over everything, or do you face into that and do you interrogate that on the show? And obviously what they do is they try to gloss over it and they try to make it look good as good as they can. And part of the show's problem is its very traditional and rigid view of what romance is and what attractiveness is and who deserves love and who doesn't, and what the perfect courtship looks like and what the perfect wedding looks like. All of these things, and their unwillingness to interrogate that is a blind spot that the show is constantly suffering from, because when they have people, when you have a person who's in a marginalized group who's the star of the show, they can't just be voted off and you can move on. These issues will constantly come up because they're in the starring role. And then if you don't cast, I mean, the show had been on the air for more than 20 seasons before they cast a Black man in the
Mhm.
lead. It was getting ridiculous. They had to do it. And they
Right.
announced it during the summer after George Floyd's death, when TV was doing all this performative stuff to speak to systemic racism. So, it just becomes a big mess if you're not willing to acknowledge what your show's actually saying about all these things. And that's their biggest problem.
Right. I've also, and then you kind of get that, you know, kind of the trajectory about these people that are put into this, either going into this situation, going on to this television show. And of course, you read later on just what the true survival rate of these couplings is, which is, a lot more marginally small than you would ever expect. You think that, you have a courtship for 6 weeks or so, that how long the season goes, which is roughly 6 weeks, 2 months. Am I right?
Yeah.
And such a quick coupling, and a quick engagement, and then a lot of the times you have that kind of inevitable, well, we broke up, and that type of thing. Or if they do get married, they do stay married
Well,
for
but
just
see,
a
you got
short
to
amount of time.
understand
Yeah.
how understand how the show's actually produced, because it's even weirder than that.
Really?
They film it over a period of, I think it's over a period of a couple months,
Okay.
way in advance.
Right.
And then the episodes are edited down. So there's a good 2 or 3 months where everyone's been on the show and they've done everything, but they can't reveal to the public what happened. And the bachelor has chosen who his person is, but they can't be seen in public together because that would reveal the end of the show. So they're
Right.
kept apart for months. So not only do you have this weird courtship that happens under camera's eye over several weeks in a highly contrived situation, they are then kept apart for months until the show finishes airing and they get together for the finale and they can finally admit publicly that they're together. So it's an even weirder situation than
Yeah, I
than
always
than
I
the
always thought the whole thing just kind of, I was like, how do you have like a a normal courtship under,
You don't.
such a
You don't.
microscope, which is almost
You
impossible,
don't.
I would imagine. So hopefully, I mean, good luck to all of them. If this is a situation that's right for them and they feel that they can make it work, great. So again,
Yeah,
apologies
well, I'm
for
not
this.
judging. I'm not judging the relationships that come out of it.
Oh,
What I am
no, of
judging
course not.
is the way the show is
Right,
presented to viewers
right,
as something that it is not.
right,
And they are not transparent about, I mean, they're not even really that transparent about how the show is even made.
right,
So so it's hard to know when you see something happening on a show, why did it happen? Did it happen because the people in the scene, that's just how they naturally reacted, or did it happen because some producer told them to make it happen? Did it happen because these people assumed that they have to make great television, so they're feeling pressure to do all this crazy stuff that normally they wouldn't do? And then what does that mean when two people, tell the world they're gonna get married?
right,
You know, I mean, no wonder, these relationships, they don't have a great track record of producing
right.
long marriages.
Yeah.
It's the most bizarre way to start a relationship with somebody I've ever seen.
It's
Um,
it's interesting, that's for
and they
sure.
try to pretend like it's a heightened thing, like it's the ultimate way to pick somebody. They're in all these glamorous locations, and they're in these really wonderful resorts, and they're going on these dream dates, and the bachelor's always a great looking guy, and most of the women are incredible looking women, and it's supposed to be this heightened thing, but the actual reality of making the show is so bizarre. It is not nearly that, but they can't
Right.
admit that.
Definitely. I mean,
So then and when the show first started, I mean, I have been, sort of dissecting the stuff. I interviewed the woman who came in, I think second or third, I can't remember, in the very first Bachelor, because she was from the Tampa Bay area, and I was working here. I was working for the newspaper here when it happened. So I interviewed her about what the process was like way back then. And so I've seen that it's highly manipulated. It's not transparent, and it's in their best interest to sort of make viewers believe that it is this incredibly romantic, wonderful thing. But at least back then, people didn't really know the show. The general public didn't know the show when it first started. So the people who were going on the show were like, well, let's see what this is like, or maybe I will find love. And then some of them were chasing fame, of course. But you had a greater mix of people who were just kind of doing it and not knowing what to expect. Now, this show has been on the air for so long. They can't have many people competing who aren't intimately familiar with what the show is, and they have their own reasons for wanting to participate in it. And so, you can't call it, a human experiment or whatever. They're often fond of saying, "Oh, this is like a social experiment." When the people coming on the show are super fans who've been watching it for years and have spent time dissecting how the dynamics work and have very focused ideas about why they're doing the show and what they want to get out of it. That is not an experiment. That is getting together a bunch of people to make compelling television with everybody sort of winking and saying, "Hey, we're going to pretend this is genuine."
right.
And frankly, I'm sorry to rant for so much,
No,
but
not at all.
I'm really not a fan of
Right,
um, reality TV in general, and The
right,
Bachelor, these kinds of shows in
right,
particular.
right. So again, thank you. Sorry about all of that, but I'm glad that you were able to answer the question for everyone in detail. And I will, of course, go back and watch it myself so I can know what you said and revisit it. So since we don't have a ton of time left, I wanted to kind of go a little forward. So as I mentioned at the beginning, of course, A&E is such a coveted beat. It always has been, it always will be. So in your experience, what specialized skills and training does someone need if they want to get started as an entertainment or arts reporter?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's really important to have a grounding in the basics of journalism. um, I feel like I'm much better and more effective as a critic because I spent time I covered a murder when I was a young journalist. I spent time covering county commission meetings. I went through public records to find out things about politicians and public initiatives. Um, I had to do all of the grunt work and research and gumshoe research, investigations that beginning journalists have to do in order to just learn how to research things. I mean, I have people ask me questions online where I'm like, you could go to Google, and in the time that it took you to ask me that question, you could go to Google and do a Google search and you'd find out the answer yourself. But to say that on social media sometimes can feel a little rude to just write ask Google. But that's what I feel like doing. Like,
Right.
60% of the time when people ask me stuff, I'm like, if you just went to Google and asked that question, you would have your answer. So now we're to the point where people aren't even, they don't even think to do that. So having the basic investigative skills of a journalist, I think, is really, really important. And it can be a problem because we have a whole level of people who have gotten into the criticism game by writing for websites, where what they were doing initially was did not involve that kind of much more significant journalistic effort. These are not necessarily people who've covered murders or covered riots or covered contentious county commission meetings, all of which I did before I became a critic. The very when I was in my very first internship, I was doing an internship for the Pittsburgh Press, and I was sort of like a second string entertainment features writer on the entertainment desk. But I wanted to be a music critic, so I told the music critic I would cover any concerts he didn't want to cover. And he loved that. So he sent me to cover this concert, which was MC Hammer, who wasn't super famous then,
Oh, shoot.
um, this band called Guy, and this band called New Edition, right? They were all on tour together.
Ooh.
And I get there to cover the concert, and the parking lot is empty. And I go to the parking lot attendant and I say, why is the parking lot empty? And he says there was a shooting. And so I'm like, oh
Uh-oh.
my God. So I grab my notebook and I run to the scene. And the cops reporter from the Metro desk was already there. And it turns out what happened was that one member of Guy's crew shot and killed a member of New Edition's crew. They had gotten into a fight while they were setting up the gear, and one of them pulled out a weapon and shot and killed the other person. I'd never heard of that happening before. And so the cops reporter covered the incident, the shooting, and the response to it. And I was tasked with finding out what led up to it. And so I found out that they had gotten into a fight at the stop before they played in Pittsburgh. And I guess Guy and New Edition had been in conflict about how long each of them was going to play when they were the second in the bill. It was always MC Hammer first, and then at some stops it was Guy and then New Edition, and at some stops it was New Edition and then Guy. And from what I understand, one of the bands was playing long, and the other band had their roadies go on stage and start taking their stage gear off the stage. This was in South Carolina while they were playing. And so everybody got into a fight. The concert stopped. The cops had to break it up, and there was like an hour and a half delay before they finished the show. And then they had to come to Pittsburgh, and they were all angry, right? And so they start setting up gear, and someone, I think from New Edition's crew, went outside for a smoke or something and got attacked by 6 guys um, who had driven up in a sedan. And the suspicion was that somebody who was connected to Guy had had some enforcers come down and try to put some fear into New Edition's people by catching one of their people outside and beating them up. But what happened was everybody came out and a giant fight started, and then the shooting happened. That was what I remember happened. This was a long time ago. This was in the mid-90s. So so I helped cover all that. I got a front page byline, and I was one of the rare interns who was invited to join the staff when I graduated college because I helped them cover that story.
Wow.
So when you cover something like that, that really positions you to be able to handle all the things that a critic has to do in the normal course of things. And it allows that if you're at a concert and something happens that is really news, you can cover it. You don't have to ask for help from the Metro desk. Things won't fall through the cracks. You are a journalist with skills who can do the job. And I think one of the issues, for example, just to flash back for a minute to the Bachelor situation, when I asked the Bachelor producers that question, I think they were used to dealing with journalists who didn't have that kind of background and wouldn't necessarily ask really incisive questions. And I think that's something that we're losing in entertainment journalism, because more of the people who are covering entertainment are coming from these websites where they're almost kind of they're a mixture of fan service and entertainment stories, and they don't have that background of hard news and sort of being incisive and challenging that you would have if you worked at a local newspaper. When I first started going to the TV Critics press tour, it was filled with journalists who covered TV for the Dallas Morning News or the Chicago Tribune or the Fort Worth Star Telegram, the St. Petersburg Times. We had all come up through journalism. We had all covered newsy things. And so when we were in a press conference with the head of CBS, we would ask them substantive questions because that was our training. But, when you come up and, you haven't done that kind of work, and then you're in a press conference with the producers from The Bachelor, you get so wrapped up in asking them about, storylines on the show or celebrities who appeared on it, and you're not thinking about the deeper, more incisive questions about how they do what they do. So a background in the basics of journalism is important. What's also important is to develop expertise. The way the film world works is different than the way the world of TV works, which is different than the way the world of streaming works, which is different than the way pop music works, which is different than the way ballet works, which is different. You know what I mean? And understanding why things happen the way they happen and understanding the importance of something when it happens means you have to kind of know how that industry operates. You have to know how they make money. You have to know what's losing money. You have to know how success is judged. You have to know where privilege and prestige comes from and where disgrace comes from, and to learn all that stuff, you really have to learn how the industry works. So when I was tasked to cover television, I spent a lot of time talking to people who worked in local television so I could find out how local TV newscasts worked and what was successful and what wasn't, who were the big dogs, who weren't, all of that stuff. And I spent a lot of time talking to people who worked in television nationally. So, I spent time talking to the head of FX. I spent time talking to the head of HBO. I spent time talking to producers who worked on different shows. I visited the sets of ER, the Sex and the City, 6 Feet Under, Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I visited the sets of all these shows and talked to the executive producers and talked to the actors and really got a sense of how production worked and what it took to make an hour of television. The West Wing, Paula Yu, who's on the call here, was a writer for the West Wing around the time that I
Paula
visited.
says hi.
Yeah.
Hi, Paula.
Yeah, around the time that I visited the set. So it's important, in getting to know people like Paula has given me a real insight into, how they make television, which helps me judge the television that gets made. So you have to develop an expertise, and you want to be able to, if I have to, I can cover a classical music concert, or I could cover a visual art display in a museum, but I wouldn't do it as well as somebody who really knows those industries. So I think it's important to develop an expertise that's connected to what you love and what you think is important, and because that also distinguishes you. You know, um, if you're a generalist who knows a little bit about a bunch of stuff, it can help you cover a wide range of stories. But when you want some real insight into, how the Atlanta Orchestra is operating, or, why, certain pieces were bought by the MoMA and certain pieces weren't, and does that have any real significance? You need somebody who really knows those areas. And so it's important to develop an expertise. So you want to have an expertise. You want to have a grounding in journalism abilities, and then you want to have great taste, because part of the job often involves telling people what's good and what's not. And you want to be open-minded about the fact that there are things out there that may not fit your taste that your audience may still enjoy. So I always tell the story about Gene Siskel, who was the other major film critic in Chicago for a long time. And Gene Siskel and I, when I was young, I read Roger Ebert, who worked for the Sun Times, because his tastes and mine were really well matched. And so if he liked something, I'd probably like it. If he hated it, I probably would hate it. It was the exact opposite with Gene Siskel. Our tastes were pretty distant. So if he liked something, I knew I probably wouldn't like it. And if he liked something, I had a sense, I might find this pretentious, or I might not get into this. But I could read him. I could read an engaging, wonderful story about what he thought about something, and I could decide whether or not I wanted to go see that movie. Now, maybe not in the way that you would normally expect. I wouldn't read his review and agree with it. I would read his review and I would say, oh, he didn't like it, but that sounds like something I might want to see, because he described his point of view so well that I understood why he liked it or why he didn't like it, and I could compare it to my own taste. And so that's what I think you have to be able to do as a critic, is describe your take on something to the point where even somebody who disagrees with you can learn enough to decide whether or not they want to experience that thing themselves, whether or not they want to pay the money for the movie ticket, or pay the money for the streaming service subscription, or take the amount of time that it takes to go on cable TV and watch this thing. And ultimately, you're trying to sort of tell great stories about what's out there and cut through the hype, and expose hypocrisy and falsity and bad faith. So it's a lot. It's a lot. But if you can get it down, man, it's like the most amazing job in the world.
Definitely. So we got one more question, and then we're going to wrap up for the evening. And this is one that's been sitting in my mind for quite a while, and I wanted to definitely hear your take on it. With all the layoffs, the restructuring, the competition now for staff positions at newspapers and websites and networks across the board, not to mention an uptake in celebrities and social media influencers who do not have training in journalism, they're not trained journalists, landing and conducting these celebrity interviews, or they're hosting high profile celebrity events. What advice can you give to current and aspiring A&E journalists in this rapidly changing landscape?
Yeah, I think you have to, like I said before, you have to figure out what you bring to this that is unique. What do you bring to this that is different than what anyone else can bring? And then you try to find out a way to showcase that in your coverage. So it doesn't necessarily mean um, chasing the celebrity that will give you the page views, or chasing the stories that will get people angry online, so it'll make them engage with your content. That just feels like such a cynical exercise to me. I think it's more important to sort of figure out what kind of coverage brings you fulfillment and makes you feel like this is why you want to do the job. And then you figure out how to provide that in a form that gets you hired somewhere or that makes enough money that you can do it yourself. And I know that seems like kind of a vague answer, but what's important about where we are now is that there are a lot of different pathways to get to the same goal. When I started, there were many fewer pathways, but there were more stable goals. Generally, the idea was that you would get hired by a significant newspaper, and then you would work your way up the food chain, working at better and better newspapers until you landed at a newspaper that was good enough, or the situation was fulfilling enough that that's where you wanted to spend most of your career. And so, the people I worked alongside, worked their way up the chain until they got to the New York Times or they got to the Washington Post. Those were the two big destination papers, and maybe the Chicago Tribune and LA Times after that. And but when I was in Florida working at the Tampa Bay Times, the newspaper industry kind of fell apart, and those goals then started to not make sense. And so for me, sort of landing at a destination was more about being somewhere where I could have a national voice as a critic, and I could do the kind of work that I thought was important and ethical and groundbreaking, and that was NPR. So now younger people have a situation where they can start a Substack, or they can try to write for a range of different websites, or they could go to a newspaper and see if they can convince them to hire them. But there's many fewer jobs for covering entertainment at most newspapers these days, and there's a lot more competition for those jobs, so they're harder to get. But there are still some newspapers that hire for those jobs. Washington Post is hiring a chief theater critic as we speak. So there's lots of different avenues out there, but the goal, of course, is to earn a living doing this work, and that's a little more difficult proposition now. The main thing is, you know, from the Society of Professional Journalists perspective, you got to work hard to try and avoid situations where you're being exploited, and you have to work hard to try and avoid situations where you're creating this empty content that's just all about amassing page views and generating interest in social media, because that's ultimately not going to produce a lot of substantive work, and it's not going to advance your abilities as a journalist or a communicator or as a critic. And so when an opportunity does open up to get one of these big critics jobs, you won't be ready because you have spent so much time creating clickbait. So
Right.
the question is so the challenge is to come up with a way to do the kind of work that you want to do, that progresses you as a journalist and that creates great content and that makes an impact and that positions you. So when that chief theater critic job opens up, you can be a credible candidate for it.
Great. Well, can you please share with our viewers now about what's on the horizon for you, how people can check out your work, as well as your book, Race Baiter, which I'm so sorry we didn't get a chance to kind of dive into.
That's
Um,
okay.
give a little taste of where we can find you other than NPR and what's coming up for you.
Sure. So you can find me on NPR, on radio stations across the country. I have a story on a new series on Max called The Girls on the Bus, a review running on tomorrow's All Things Considered. So, every week I might have a review that would be on any of our news magazines, All Things Considered, or Morning Edition, or the weekend shows. And I also, most Fridays, I appear on our midday show Here and Now, and I talk about TV things. I'm not sure what the subject will be this week, but I'm probably going to be on Here and Now on Friday. Tomorrow on Thursday, I'm also going to be on LAist, used to be known as KPCC. It's one of the two NPR stations in Los Angeles. And they have a show called Air Talk featuring this host, Larry Mantle, who's a great guy, really smart. And we're going to talk about the decline of cable television. And that should be around 1:30 Eastern, around 10:30 Pacific. So you can listen to that by streaming, of course, or by podcast. So you could hear that. I'm on X/Twitter at Deggans. I'm on Instagram at eDeggans. I'm on Facebook, eDeggans. And my website is ericdeggans.com. And if you go there, the homepage has a running tally of stories that are on my Tumblr page and are, that I do for NPR. So that's a good place to sort of check in and see what I'm working on right now and what I've been working on in recent months. Paula did ask a question. If
Yep.
today's journalists must have the extra responsibility of helping to educate readers and viewers who are having trouble distinguishing between actual reportage and glorified press releases and or false info. And yeah, I do think I've been trying to do a lot of that as a critic, basically increase people's media literacy.
Right.
I do personal presentations where I come and give speeches and talk about how people can increase their media literacy. And I also do it in my work. I write a lot about, when I write about, Joe Rogan and race, part of what I'm trying to do is educate people to how these issues play out in media and give them a little bit of media literacy to help them decode what somebody like Joe Rogan or what's his name, Alex, what's that guy?
Oh, Alex Jones.
Alex Jones. Yeah, I just
Yes.
watched a documentary on him. Yeah, Alex Jones, like how they do what they do and why their messages are so effective and how you can sort of think through what they're saying in a way that neutralizes their message. All of that is media literacy. And I do feel like journalists have to do a better job of helping the audience understand and find a difference between genuine, accurate journalism, genuine journalism that, where we may have made a mistake, and then bad faith messages that are deliberately trying to mislead people. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where people are in their information bubbles and they don't trust a lot of media messaging that's outside of that information bubble. And some of these platforms have gotten so radicalized that what they are telling their audiences is drastically different from what the actual situation is. And so, it's become more important for organizations like the Society of Professional Journalists to work really hard to educate the public about how to decode these messages and which platforms to avoid because they're filled with misinformation and disinformation. And I would put Fox News at the top of that list. And I know there are some people who don't want to hear that. But
Right.
that news outlet is a political operation disguised as a cable news channel, and it is filled with misleading and stories. And it also doesn't give you a really good sense. You can watch hours and hours of Fox News and not have much of a sense of what actually happened in the world that day because so much of their coverage is focused on serving their own political goals rather than informing their audience. And so it's important to get better tools for dissecting all of this stuff. And I think part of the problem is that the public is used to sitting back and passively consuming media. They are not as used to what they need to do now, which is be active, incisive, skeptical consumers of high quality media. You need to treat your media consumption the way you treat your food consumption and avoid eating at McDonald's and Wendy's and try to aim for the much more wholesome food.
They put Sandstorm in the Wendy's commercial, so I'm kind of feeling my age now that came out, and I'm just like one of the most just greatest techno songs that's come out in the last say 25 30 years, and kind of plunked in there, and my heart sank for about 2 seconds.
Well, I'll tell you,
Well,
I had to change my diet recently. Not recently. I had to
really?
change my diet about 6 months ago. Haven't eaten at a Wendy's in at least that long, and I feel a lot better, and I've lost 30 pounds. So I'm
Oh,
telling you,
good.
when it comes to the information equivalent of Wendy's and McDonald's, just say no. Just say no.
Well, thank you so much on that note. That's all the time we have. I'd like to thank you, Eric, for coming on to chat with us, as well as SPJ New England for presenting this series. If you missed any portion of this discussion or just want to watch it one more time, it'll be posted on SPJ New England's YouTube channel in a couple of days. And there you can check out the previous Zoom discussions all in one handy place. Be sure to follow SPJ New England's social media for upcoming events and information. Thank you to Eric once again. Thank you to all of you for being here. I'm Katie Kostakis. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.